Thank you, and good morning. Thanks for having me here. I have to tell you, I was honored, but a little also surprised that I was asked to give the keynote, only because it was my first time meeting you and being involved in the organization. Of course, I heard of the organization and at times had cited to it in my own writing. But my background is not one of technical knowledge. So I was wondering why some of you all, the technical masters that keep things running, would want to hear from me. And then I spoke to Danny and asked the advice of my husband, who comes from a technical background, and came to understand that maybe I could offer some thoughts or ideas for you all to think about when it comes to what I can offer. So a little bit of, I hate talking about myself, but they said it might make sense for me to talk a little bit about my background so you all know why I would be talking about this today. So I'm trained as a lawyer and spent most of my time working on international legal issues. After law school, I went to the government, and for most of my government career, I was at CIA in the Office of General Counsel. In the 90s, my entrance or introduction to cyber work began in the 90s when I was given an account that was then called information warfare. Don't know what they're calling it these days, but that's where I began my work in terms of the international cyber operations, if you will, that was going on in 1996. Soon thereafter, of course, I was involved with things like Solar Sunrise and Moonlight Maze, and now we could go on. But after I left CIA, I spent about 4 years at the White House, again working on intelligence issues as a career government employee before I started at Georgetown, where I've been teaching on cyber, international law, and national security law. For the last 10 years, I've worked mainly internationally, involved with other international lawyers and the diplomats from other countries, involved in negotiating, if you will, the rules of the road in the cyber domain. And this is what I wanted to speak about today. So I prepared some formal remarks to set up kind of the setting or the background as to what is going on at the international level among states. Not so much on what they've been doing, because now we have a good sense of what states have been doing in this domain, but about what's going on in terms of negotiating rules, and if that's possible for constraining state behavior in this domain. And I'll come from this at an international legal perspective, as well as kind of the political view. So my title of the talk that I prepared, and also we've left plenty of time for questions. So my husband did warn me, do not be boring in your talk. So he's also given me some advice as more of a technical person that what you might be interested in. So during the talk, as I set up the background, I have been encouraged to talk about practical things that we all would have read about in the paper. And although originally thinking you might not be interested, I've been told that you would be interested in talking about the legal issues surrounding things like Stuxnet or the DNC hack or DDoSes against US banks and things like that. So I will discuss those, but hopefully we can continue that in a Q&A, which we've left time for. So the title of the talk is How International Politics Has Come to Cyberspace. Because the security of cyberspace is an integral part of today's security, warfare, and politics, it is important to understand that activities in cyberspace ought not to be separated into a standalone area without the broader political, strategic, and geopolitical context. It is important to understand how cyberspace is a political domain and what rules are currently being negotiated among states for behavior in that domain. Indeed, the strategic use of cyberspace to pursue political goals and to seek a geostrategic advantage is increasing, and we will likely not see any change in direction on this matter. Today, governments and non-state actors are utilizing cyberspace to act out their geopolitical differences and to promote their political objectives. This talk will discuss the international political playbook that is only beginning to emerge among states, with international and national discussions about cyber attacks in the context of the relevant international laws and how to respond to them under existing international legal frameworks. What began in 1986 as a conduit for academic messages and file sharing, the Internet eventually evolved into a space open to just about everyone on the planet. Many say that it was the decentralization of control over this resource that resulted in one of the most significant periods of technological innovation and economic transformation in history. For the engineers, the Internet was both a creation and a reflection of the engineering community. Its norms were their norms, they believed, and its regulation, like its open protocols, should represent those norms. The Internet and the broader domain of cyberspace, however, for the past decades, has become the purview of more centralized control by state actors to pursue political objectives. Today, it is clear that states are hardly about to relinquish their stake in this domain. As state officials have reminded everyone, dispelling the myths of digital utopia, the Internet depends on human beings and brick-and-mortar intermediaries like banks and ISPs, all of which take up real space in the real world, in some state's jurisdiction, under the jurisdiction of that state's laws, and therefore subject to the control by that state. As with past technologies that have emerged, states will struggle to employ them for particular political ends, trying to preserve their own interests. Over the past 2 decades, governments and non-state actors have become increasingly sophisticated in their attacks on the digital systems that states depend on for essential services, economic prosperity, and security. Such breaches have threatened critical infrastructure, intellectual property, privacy of users' data, important national security information, and government personnel data. Because of the advances in technology and the increasing dependency on cyberspace, the issue of cybersecurity and the need for rules and common approaches to it are becoming an increasingly important issue. Issues related to cyberspace and its uses have vaulted into the highest realm of high politics. While cyberspace used to be considered largely a matter of low politics, background conditions, and processes, today, cybersecurity has become a focal point for conflicting domestic and international interests, and increasingly for the protection of state power. Analysis of actions in the cyber domain are often divided into 5 levels: policies and goals, strategies, operations, and tactics and tools. Actions at all these levels are important, but sometimes there is a tendency to only concentrate on tactics and tools in cybersecurity, and strongly from the technical point of view. In my work and in this talk, I approach cyber affairs primarily from the international diplomacy and legal point of view because of the increasing importance of cyber affairs in today's interconnected world and in international politics and law. For an example, from a non-technical international legal perspective, the importance of what is taking place in the cyber domain is illustrated by NATO's recognition of cyberspace as a domain of operations in which NATO must defend itself as effectively as it does in the air, on land, and at sea. NATO also has made a political decision with international legal ramifications to invoke Article 5 in response to cyber attacks. Another recent example from the U.S. is the announcement in October of 2016 from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence that the Russian government directed the compromises of the emails of U.S. persons and institutions, including U.S. political organizations, and they stated, quote, "These thefts and disclosures are intended to interfere with the U.S. election process." Since the 1990s, states have been discussing the effects of information and telecommunication technology on international peace and security. In 1998, it was the Russians who were the first to table a resolution at the UN Security Council on the developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. They sought to have an international treaty that would outlaw cyber warfare. With significant doubts about the Russians' intentions and concerns about the lack of verification capability related to any such treaty, the U.S. refused to consider this treaty. Since then, several significant cyber incidents have made front-page headlines, and a growing number of governments have been developing new policies and institutions on the political and military use of cyberspace. As a result, an active debate is now taking place about what norms should govern behavior in cyberspace, how to build confidence and increase stability, and how to build up the capability of states to address cybersecurity threats within their own borders. Such norms in this context are understood as broadly shared expectations of appropriate behavior by states in cyberspace. Although lawyers frequently use norms and laws as interchangeable terms, not all norms are laws or become laws. Yet violations of norms that do not have legal status may be effectively sanctioned by social or other extrajudicial means. For example, in contemporary American society, the public expression of racist or sexist comments are not illegal, but may cost the speaker's acceptance in some social circles or even their jobs without the speakers having judicial remedies. Often, certain practices become norms and possibly laws from below. That is, their increasingly widespread and frequent adoption can lead to their acceptance by a general public and in legal codes. In 2001, a special group of governmental experts, I'll refer to this group as the GGE, was formed under the first committee at the United Nations. They were tasked to consider existing and potential threats in the sphere of information security and possible cooperative measures between states. In other words, they were to think about developing norms in which these states could agree in terms of behavior in cyberspace. In June 2004, the UNGGE met with experts from 15 nations, including the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Importantly, that included China and Russia and the US. This second UNGGE met in 2009, and of course, by then, we had seen that Estonia had suffered a significant cyber incident in 2007, and Georgia in 2008, with governmental statements made about Russia's involvement in the incidents. The 2007 test of politically contextualized cyber attacks against Estonian government web servers and public e-services confirmed that critical information infrastructure, national information systems, and online services had become potential targets not just to criminals, but to politically and ideologically motivated state and non-state actors. In Georgia, we confirmed that cyber operations would be used within kinetic conflicts and used to take down communications before a military invasion commenced. At this time, NATO began to consider cyber threats of military relevance. It was this second UNGGE that resulted in a general recognition of the existence of international security issues relevant to information security threats. Fast forward to 2013, when the UNGGE importantly reached consensus on the applicability of international law to cybersecurity, specifically the UN Charter, and the importance of maintaining peace and stability and promoting an open, secure, peaceful, and accessible ICT environment. The group recommended the further study and development of common understandings of how such norms, some of which had been codified already in international law, shall apply to state behavior in this domain. A little bit about the UN Charter. The UN Charter matters because it outlines the right to war and when it is legitimate for states to actually use war or use force. Another important aspect of this discussion was the application of international humanitarian law, often referred to as the laws of armed conflict, or LOAC, and its guidance on the conduct of war. Initially, some states, such as China, contested this notion that LOAC, or IHL, would be relevant when you're dealing with operations in cyberspace. They, like Russia, called for a new law to be developed separate from any of the laws that we had usually and historically operated under during time of conflict. This agreement, though, between the UNGG members to address this paved the way for states to discuss not whether, but how international law applies to cyberspace and how to interpret and translate existing provisions as they affect this new area of activity. In its last UNGG report released in 2015, the group reached consensus on 3 important peacetime norms. First was that nations should not intentionally damage each other's critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. Second, states should not target each other's cyber emergency responders. And third, states should assist other nations investigating cyber attacks and cyber crime launched from their territories. The 2015 report draws heavily on the 2013 report from the UNGG, taking as its starting point the earlier statement that international law applies to the use of ICTs. It repeats that state sovereignty and related principles apply to state conduct of ICT-related activities, and that states enjoy jurisdiction over ICT infrastructure within their own territories. There are a few important additions compared to the 2013 report that did make it into the final text of the 2015 report. The list of applicable international law principles in the new report included state sovereignty, sovereign equality, the settlement of disputes by peaceful means, refraining from the threat or the use of force in international relations, non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The list can be seen as signaling worries on the part of some of the UNGG members about possible interventions in their internal affairs and breaches of sovereignty vis-a-vis cyberspace. In this context, for example, Russia and China in particular have been strongly emphasizing the principle of information sovereignty in their diplomatic efforts, something quite different from what the United States terms as cybersecurity. In the context of the law governing self-defense, the report refers to, quote, the inherent right of states to take measures consistent with international law and as recognized in the UN Charter. This language does sound familiar. In fact, it's very similar to the language in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which recognizes every state's right to act in self-defense if suffering an armed attack. But within this document, the words in the Article 51 were not mentioned. It's implicitly referring to self-defense, but the report notably failed to explicitly mention Article 51 of the UN Charter and the word self-defense. The conspicuous absence of the word self-defense is due to the aversion of certain GGE members to the idea of the militarization of cyberspace. Russia and China in particular have maintained their position that they will not agree to putting these words in any report because to do so, in their view, would be opening up the cyber domain to conflict. But really, is that what is going on? At least with the Russians and the Chinese. So let me deviate for one moment, because this is where my husband said you'd be interested, and I wouldn't be boring you all too much. So last year, in April of last year, I was in Geneva and taking part in a meeting of the UNGG members. So the UNGG are a group now composed of 25 states, always with the 5 permanent members. So China and Russia and the US have been the most actively involved and where there is most contention over these rules. And the reports they come up with, although not law, they are diplomatic efforts and, if you will, the norms. Agreements to do something or not do something in the cyber domain. Last April, they invited a number of international legal scholars to come and talk to the actual members of the UNGGE. The most interesting conversations I had was with the representative in his official title. He is Putin's special envoy for international cooperation and information security. Effectively, Ambassador, or Andrei Krutsky, is Michelle Markov's counterpart, Michelle being the US government rep from State Department who's been negotiating these norms under Chris Painter's office as the coordinator of cyber issues in State Department. Anyway, Ambassador Krutsky informed me that, in his words, the cat was already out of the bag when it came to the militarization of cyberspace. He actually cited to it, I actually was surprised by the number itself, but he said that there were 150 or so states that have military operations dedicated to cyber. So he began by telling me this, and yet, when both he and the Chinese ambassador engaged me on the issue of the relevance of the law of armed conflict or the principle of self-defense in cyberspace, they maintained the position that the reason why they were opposed to making any agreement formalized that there is this right of self-defense in cyberspace, or that the Geneva and Hague Convention, as we know them, would be in operation during conflict in cyberspace, They said the reason why they're not agreeing to that is because they do not want to militarize cyberspace. So I kind of kindly reminded the ambassador as to what he informed me and others of, the fact that the cat was already out of the bag, and I didn't get much of a response after that. So there has been quite a lot of uncertainty as to, other than people's conclusions, that of course China and Russia might be reserving and preserving for their own these operations to be conducted whether in time of peace or time of war without any agreed restrictions on these activities. Particularly the Chinese ambassador at the time spoke quite, I wouldn't say aggressively, but enthusiastically to me, that they felt so strongly that this has to be a peaceful domain. And yet, when I said if it's inevitable that we have conflicts and that we see operations in cyber being used during even kinetic conflict, that wouldn't it be better actually to have the same playbook to operate from? So our operators on both sides would know what rules, based on the Geneva and Hague Conventions, were they to follow. And they thought that that was not a good idea. So as of now, there is no agreement, although we can say that they implicitly have agreed through the UNGG reports. If you look at those reports on the UN website, there is no explicit mention of self-defense in the cyber domain during time of peace, and there is no specific reference to the law of armed conflict. So the Russians took a similar position with respect to another language that was in the 2015 report that I discussed with them at the meeting. In the report, there's reference to, quote, international legal principles of humanity, necessity, proportionality, and distinction, as the report makes note of it. These words are actually in the 2015 UNGG report, but there is no reference in the report to LOAC, or the law of armed conflict. Now, international legal scholars can easily recognize that these principles are actually found within the principles of the laws of armed conflict. Again, this obvious failure to actually cite LOAC in the context of international humanitarian law alludes to the reluctance of some states to include any direct reference to the possible military activities in cyberspace. But what does that really mean? So within LOAC itself, we know, and states have been operating for years under the Geneva and Hague Convention, which dictate how during time of conflict hostilities will take place, meaning what is a legitimate target, what is not a legitimate target, what is a lawful weapon to be used, and what are illegal weapons under the Hague Convention. Nevertheless, by affirming that the principles and the rules that regulate state activities in armed conflicts may apply to cyber activities, at least the 20 states, if you're thinking optimistically, have implicitly acknowledged at least that should cyber operations occur in armed conflicts, they are subject to the same rules as kinetic warfare. Unfortunately, I was not as optimistic in that meeting or coming out of the meeting. I was quickly reminded by Michelle Markgraf at State Department, that's why I'm not a diplomat, and I should remain within the legal profession. There are, of course, challenges in negotiating these agreements, but what I wouldn't want is, coming from these meetings, there to be any misconception by those that read the announcements by State Department or others that there is a clear agreement on the rules of the road when it comes to cyberspace, because there is not currently. What does this mean, though, for the private sector entities that may be supporting the U.S. Department of Defense efforts during a time of conflict? Would a service provider supporting the DoD during conflict be a legitimate target as a combatant? Well, the answer is yes. During time of conflict, communications supporting military operations, as some of you may know, are legitimate targets. Concerning the issue of attribution, another issue that came up at that meeting and a point of great contention, particularly with the Russians, the UNGG 2015 report notes that, quote, the indication that an ICT activity was launched or otherwise originates from a state's territory or from its ICT infrastructure may be insufficient in itself to attribute the activity to the state. We're going to come back to this topic because generally international law favors this conclusion, and I'll talk about the Tallinn Manual in a few minutes, and that group of international legal experts came out with the same finding. that just because it emanates from a country and just because it might emanate from a government facility does not mean you'll be able to attribute it as an international legal matter to that state. Attribution is very important when it comes to international law and the ability of a state, for instance, to use self-defense in response to an attack from another state. So this issue will be a point of contention going forward. Another issue related to the Russians' position was something newly noted in the 2015 report. In the report, it says, quote, "The accusations of organizing and implementing wrongful acts brought against states should be substantiated." Well, I can tell you from being in that meeting and hearing why the Russians insisted on that. So it's in the report. The report, as it's written, never identifies which state insisted on which provision in this report, because I was told diplomats don't do that. But I do know it was the Russians that insisted on that statement. And the reason being is because they were quite upset that the U.S. had called North Korea out for the Sony hack. And their position was that it was unfair. But is the Russian position an indication of efforts to develop a new requirement under international law? For under traditional international law, if a state suffers an armed attack or a use of force, or even only a violation of its sovereignty, which is probably where lawyers would come out on the Sony hack, the victim state is always free under international law to call out the state that it believes is responsible. There is no requirement under international law to substantiate that claim before any court or before the UN Security Council for those claims. And even if the victim state were to use force in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter because it suffered an armed attack, which I would say the Sony incident was not an armed attack, it has the right to do so without first having to substantiate its claims at a court or at the UN. However, of course, that state acting in self-defense might be required to explain its actions and defend them after the fact before an international court. We have about 5 international court decisions by the International Court of Justice on the use of force and self-defense. So there's not many that come up, but that might be a venue in which a state would be called upon to justify its actions in self-defense, but certainly not beforehand. All in all, well, an aside, when I brought the issue of this up, again to the diplomats, this to my only U.S. government fellows working on the issue at the meeting, they told me not to worry about it, that this was something that diplomats had to kind of give and take, and that they were given this to the Russians in this document, but it really didn't mean anything, that it wouldn't have an impact, at least from my perspective, what I was thinking about, the development of international law and state practice in this regard. But that is part of the report, and it is signed by the 20 states saying that they agreed to the words within this report. All in all, the 2015 report is not a major breakthrough from the international legal perspective, but neither is it a really bad step back from the past achievements, which is still a remarkable result taking into consideration the countries involved in agreeing on the text. So this is me being an optimist about diplomatic efforts in this space. For instance, Andrei Krutsky himself, one of the co-authors of the document, said, quote, "In view of emerging risks in this regard, we, Russia, and a number of other countries were against signaling out Article 51, the UN Charter, self-defense. The report reflects the position of Russia and its partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS that the main goal is not to legalize and not to regulate conflicts in the information space, but to prevent using ICT, information and communication technologies, in the political and military purposes." So some real-world examples, again, so I'm not so boring. Taking kind of the law, as I've mentioned so far, the UN Charter and the use of force and the self-defense Article 51, one might want to think about analyzing certain incidents that we see happening around the world and publicly discussed. So first, let's take up Stuxnet. You know, whatever state did it, and we don't, for purposes of analyzing it under international law, you really don't need to know which state, but you do need to analyze it under the concept that it was a state or multiple states conducting this operation. For purposes of international law, that's what make it relevant, that it was a state actor. So I think most people would concede that it was the state actors that, or one or two that were involved. So let's assume it was a state actor. Questions that you would ask if you're an international lawyer assessing the legality of it is first, under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, was it a use of force? Uses of forces under that article are prohibited under international law. Second question is, was it an armed attack? Armed attack being a higher threshold than a use of force for purposes of the UN Charter. If it was an armed attack, of course, it would trigger Article 51 self-defense. So most likely, and most international lawyers, while there's some disagreement, would say that it was likely not an armed attack, that under the international legal reasoning of the Nicaragua court, the ICJ in 1986, an old case but still relevant, that high threshold of what is an armed attack under international law was not met, meaning, in shorthand, there was no death. While there was some destruction, maybe compromising of some of the centrifuges, even a large number of them, you didn't see anything blow up and you didn't see people dying. But if it was a use of force, then the question becomes whether this was a lawful use of force. It is probably considered a use of force for purposes of Article 2 of the UN Charter. Under the Charter, there are two exceptions only to a use of force. Security Council authorization, which in that case was not to be had, at least, and Security Council typically doesn't do anything in secret. So we have no Security Council authorization. The other one is the exception would be Article 51 was triggered, meaning did you suffer an armed attack, and therefore can you use force in self-defense? There have been some creative arguments to try to piece together whether the states that may have conducted this actually suffered an armed attack beforehand. Likely would not work under the law. The only other exception is in customary international law, and that is anticipatory self-defense, which you could use force before an armed attack occurs, but another high threshold that threat of an armed attack has to be imminent, overwhelming, no time for deliberation, and no other means to resolve it. Highly unlikely that you would meet that threshold. So, analyzing another case. So some have discussed publicly that maybe the US banks that suffered the DDoS attacks after Stuxnet was released, it was a response to Stuxnet. So in analyzing those DDoS attacks, you'd look at the same legal framework under international law as to whether this was a lawful response to the Stuxnet operation. So typically under international law, if you suffer a use of force, not an armed attack, but something less, a use of force, what a state is entitled to do is conduct non-forcible countermeasures. Non-forcible countermeasures would be actions that would typically be unlawful under international law, but because you're responding to a state that has broken its legal obligations to you, you are able to use countermeasures as long as they are not forcible. The key here is with countermeasures, you must attribute it to the state. So if there is no attribution under international law to a state actor in Stuxnet, and attribution is more than speculation, then there would be no lawful right to use force in or anything below the use of force in self-defense. And lastly, under a countermeasure, the private sector would be off limits. So even if you met the attribution and you are acting as a countermeasure, you cannot take a countermeasure against banks. The DNC hack, we might want to come back to that in Q&A, but we can talk about how that'd be analyzed. So overall, though, considering the mandate of the GGE, that it was supposed to study how international law applies in cyberspace, and after agreeing if and when it applies, the results are modest, but they show the willingness of the GGE members to discuss and agree on the applicability of particular rules of international law. If any further progress is to be made in this group, it may be that they'll come up with a longer list of such rules as it's envisioned in its mandate, and it provides space for discussion. However, there are limits to what that group of state officials are willing to consider in their negotiations. For example, they have been opposed to addressing the issue of cyber exploitation or cyber-enabled espionage for political and military purposes. Cyber espionage, for both the political and economic purposes, has been discussed in the context of the UNGG, but not in a way where they would be willing to come to any agreement. Instead, the U.S. government came to a bilateral agreement with China in September of 2015, which both sides agreed that neither would, quote, conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets or other confidential business information, with the intent of providing competitive advantages to companies or commercial sectors. This agreement set the stage for a very similar language to be adopted by, that was adopted by the G20 group, widening the scope of this agreement substantially. But this agreement only covers a particular aspect, and that is IP theft, otherwise referred to as cyber-enabled economic espionage. But with respect to the political and military espionage activities, there is no such agreement with respect to cyber operations, and this is in line with what international law traditionally does when it comes to espionage. It is not regulated under international law. So likely this group will not have occasion nor interest in discussing the political and military acts of espionage in the cyber domain. And that's why we can talk about the DNC, at least the first half of that operation, where it was just the hacking and stealing of information, similar to the OPM breach, where that was traditional espionage. Indeed, there have been questions raised as to whether this UNGG group has reached its limit in what it can accomplish with respect to state agreement on norms. At times, the process has been criticized for the lack of enforcement of some of the agreement upon norms by the states, such as the 2015 agreement not to target the critical infrastructure of other states through cyber means, because after all, we did see the Ukrainian power stations targeted. For example, one of the critics, somebody who actually plays an extensive role in not only negotiating, his people who work for him have been involved in the UNGG, but for the country of Israel itself, the head of the Israeli National Cyber Bureau, Dr. Matanya, criticized the U.S. State Department strategy for developing international cybersecurity norms, although they have been a member of the UNGG. Dr. Matanya called the plans overly broad. According to what he has recently spoken about at a conference in Washington, D.C. last year, the, quote, the norm of do not attack critical infrastructures sounds great, but can you define for me what critical infrastructures are? The definition in every nation is different. Some will define everything as critical. In other words, the success of the agreements reached so far depends largely on their implementation. The 2015 cyber attack against the electric grid in western Ukraine, which took its power offline for several hours, was arguably surprising to some, given the agreement earlier that year in which the UNGG states committed to the voluntary norm not to target critical infrastructure during peacetime. And of course, Russia was one of the members who signed that report. Another notable effort, and I hope someone's keeping track of the time because I want to get into questions, but, oh, 7 minutes left, is that what it means? But then we have Q&A, right? That's in total? Okay, then I should stop now. How long? Okay, so I'm going to believe that timer. I'm going to stop. The other part, I was going to talk about one other effort, and it was based on the Tallinn Manual, which is an international manual based on legal experts around the country looking at international law and how it's relevant to cyberspace. They just released, like this week, in the US, where they're having a launch in DC on Wednesday, they released Tallinn 2. The first Tallinn Manual dealt with law of armed conflict and use of force. Tallinn 2.0 is going to deal with everything below the use of force. So that's norm of non-intervention, that they said they were going to deal with espionage, and it looks like they basically went away with that, but issues of sovereignty. So if you're interested in that, I can talk a little more, but I do want to take some questions, and I'll have to answer them quickly.
Hi, Michael Sinatra, YesNet. That was an awesome talk, thank you. I'm really interested in...
So I wasn't boring? Can I tell my husband?
Wasn't boring.
Okay.
Tell your husband you weren't boring. At least I didn't think you were boring. I would say, what interests me is are there ongoing efforts now to create international regimes or NGOs to kind of deal with the cyber aspects of international law? Because it really feels like a GGE is like very much a temporary thing that just kind of comes and goes. and is either under the auspices of the UN or somewhere else, is there any kind of ongoing work that's going to be done that will just keep sort of adjudicating these sorts of things, or is that just going to go away and get folded into existing regimes and things like that?
It's a good question. So first and foremost, the UNGGE itself, the members, and at the meeting last April in Geneva, that came up for discussion, whether the UNGGE ought to even continue, whether it's been useful under the UN, the auspices of the UN, or have they reached their limit. The significance of that group is that you have state officials in that group. So that's for the development of law, but also for insight into how states are perceiving what they're doing, and the development of law is important. However, there are a number of different efforts, if you will. The one that I didn't get a chance really to talk about in depth, but I would suggest that you look at the manual that's already, the first manual, the Tallinn manual, out by Cambridge University Press, that came out in 2013. That is under the auspices of the NATO, the center in Tallinn, Estonia. And the first manual was, there were about 20 international legal experts. They're basically academics. The second one just came out, and they've got 19 experts. Now, that is also a very valuable effort, but it is an academic effort, not legally binding. It is a manual, and under international law, that these manuals have been developed before to deal with like land warfare and warfare at sea. They basically take the laws and say, here's how they apply as they exist today to cyber operations, both in conflict and in peacetime. They do not look at the way it should be. Now, there are also other efforts. Some countries have been kind of in the forefront on this. So, for instance, Estonia, aside from its work at NATO and its center, Estonia has been working with the Netherlands. The Netherlands has also been in the lead. They basically created a global commission. Part of what that's looking at is the international law and the development in state practice. And then there are universities around the world, in the UK, in the US, in other countries, that are also convening people and looking at these issues. And there's a global conference that is now, I think, in its 6th iteration. It started with what's called the London process. So the UK was the first to hold this global conference with state government officials there. The legal aspect is one part of it. But I would commend the Netherlands. They've taken up on the legal part. But another organization is the East-West Institute, and their work on norms. Microsoft, as a company, has been one of the leaders in publishing almost yearly, I think, reports on norms of both state and private sector conduct. So yeah, there's lots that's developing. Will it be only the UNGG? Doubtful. That there'll be other spaces, and some say maybe even better that it's not just the UN, under the UN.
Thanks. Matt Petak, Yahoo. I'll try to keep this brief. I know we're short on time. As an educator in foreign service, one thing I would really like to call out is you focused on nation states as actors, but the truth of the world has changed. In the past, engaging in warfare required the resources of a nation state. You couldn't get a farmer out there raising an army of 500 tanks and attacking a neighboring country. Today, a kid in their basement can launch a bigger cyber attack than most countries could ever dream of. So we need to be thinking about this not in terms strictly of nation states as actors, and focusing from that perspective overlooks that some of the most devastating impacts to cyberspace right now are not coming from nation states, they're coming from individuals. And how are our norms going to approach that when you have the equivalent of a national arsenal in the hands of a pimply-faced teenager? That's the challenge for the next generation of laws, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, recognize the point. Unfortunately, with the UNGG process alone, now there are other efforts dealing with the non-state actors, but with the UNGG, because it's part of the UN and the Secretary General established this group, the states are going to be the only members of this group. And so that is a challenge. Typically, international law itself, for many years, dealt only with state actors. When I talk about the UN Charter is only signed by states. So it is still a state-centric kind of framework, international law is. However, predominantly since the 9/11 attacks and the evolving nature of the international law, we have, or international lawyers, but states and the UN itself has operated under an acknowledgement that non-state actors can be just as powerful and just as damaging to international security and peace as states. And so the laws have evolved. The UN Charter hasn't been rewritten to deal with terrorists, for instance, nor has Geneva Convention, and yet we have an international framework which will, it wasn't easy necessarily. Even the President of the United States had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court to sort some of this out as to what rights do terrorists have when they're combatants and when they're captured and detained. But it's sorting itself out and has. So there is space under international law to deal with non-state actors. In the cyber realm, of course, you have the cyber crime efforts, which I did not talk about, but Interpol and Europol and efforts of passing domestic criminal legislation, and of course the Budapest Convention, right, to have states agree to cooperate across borders, sharing law enforcement information to get criminals. But yeah, it's a very important point. I focused only on the UN process. There are other aspects of it that certainly have been worked on, but it is something that international law has come to realize, as international relations scholars have come to realize. And I wouldn't say we have a perfect framework for it, but it is mainly because of the rise of terrorism and terrorist actors, it's come to accept the significant role of non-state actors.
So my question is on the label assigned to the Stuxnet attack. As I understand it, that was part of a larger program designed to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program that included assassination of a nuclear scientist and resulted in property damage, some of the centrifuges being damaged. How would, property damage and assassinations not be considered a violent attack?
So when I was talking about Stuxnet, I was keeping to the cyber the element of it, but
isn't it all part of one larger program? As any violent situation, you're going to have some things that don't result in death or destruction of property, and others that are more disruption. It's all part of the same program.
Yep. So under international law, what you're typically analyzing you're analyzing it by event. Now, that is in a time of peace. In time of war, things are a little different. You're looking at it from a total operation. Has this military operation as a whole been conducted in compliance with the laws of war? But when we're at a time of peace, and arguably that's the state that we're in at the time of Stuxnet, we're not in military conflict or armed hostilities with any other state, then you're analyzing it under the UN Charter. Under that body of law, use of force, you're looking at every aspect which could be part of a broader operation. So you'd want to analyze it like, okay, the assassination attempts, were they lawful? If it was a cyber incident with destruction of property, was that lawful? That's at least how the law would be used to analyze individual elements.
Most people in this room who run networks would probably think the destruction of an asset on their network was not lawful.
Yeah, so what I said is, if it's a use of force, that would not be lawful, meaning
we would likely see it as a use of force.
Yes. So personally, now not everyone agrees with me, personally when I did my legal analysis and wrote about this, my conclusion was it was a use of force. I disagreed with some international legal scholars. In fact, a colleague of mine, I have utmost respect for her, she's at Notre Dame, Mary Ellen O'Connell, found it to be, in her writing, an armed attack. So under international law and case law, the armed attack threshold is high, and that's what triggers Article 51. Use of force is something different. It's still illegal under Article 2.4. My conclusion was it was a use of force, not an armed attack. Her conclusion, it was an armed attack. But use of force is still illegal, except under the Charter, if you have one of the two exceptions to use force, which I would say hard-pressed to find either exception under the circumstances and facts as we know it publicly. So yeah, I think we're in agreement that some people might not like it because when you suffer a use of force, you cannot use force in self-defense. You can only use force in self-defense if you've triggered the armed attack. But arguably speaking, my personal legal opinion was it was a use of force.
Hi, Keith Mitchell speaking personally. Do you think we've reached the point where cyber arms reduction initiatives would be productive?
So I'm going to be a little cynical on this point. So the
Oh,
discussion
I'm asking idealistically, yeah. So.
Yeah. Short answer, no. So there have been a number of efforts, though, a number of years ago, and I think the first time I remember reading about it was when Dick Clark wrote his book on cyber war. So this was now a while ago, I guess, years are flying past. And he talks about in one of the chapters an armed control like legal regime. I then, and only have stayed kind of with the same thought, having worked more and more with the different countries, understanding more and more that how many countries are developing these operations, I do not believe that we are likely going to be able to sit down and negotiate any kind of similar arms control agreement. Now, one of the meetings that they had in Geneva, in addition to the international law one that I took part in, one was on the Wassenaar arrangement. Now, although that might not sound like it's not relevant to what you're saying, the concern by some states was the proliferation of some of these so-called cyber weapons, right, that could be harmful to human rights, freedom of speech. The idea of trying to prevent the proliferation of software, right, and limiting the development of that, I think one is hard-pressed to be able to do that at a global level. So I'm less optimistic. From my perspective, is I think the best bang for your buck is trying to get everybody at least to play from the same playbook. Like set up some rules, and we kind of had these rules before in Geneva and Hague. While some of it might need tweaking, take the law of armed conflict that we're all schooled in, and then may need some changing and adjustments, but apply that so at least when we're in a high-end conflict, we know that we're going to at least be playing from the same rules. And as well as time of peace. Take the UN Charter. Okay, they don't define the terms very well with us as to what's a use of force, what's an armed attack, but it's never been defined, even outside of cyber. But take what we do know, and at least let's agree, and that's why the positive effect of the UNGGE was for the first time states actually said, UN Charter applies. Right? Aside from Russia's like, oh, UN Charter applies, but not Article 51. That's just kind of a little sketchy under the law. That's typically not what happens. When you say the whole treaty applies, you don't say, oh, but not self-defense. So yeah, I'm less positive that at this point in time, where states like, I guess Ambassador Krutsky told me the cat is out of the bag already. I think it's going to be hard to kind of pull back from that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening to me.